thing that could happen is that I mean, we've all made cost applications for or been involved in cost applications for withdrawn appeals, and you don't get an answer quickly. And by quickly, I mean I put one in May and I still haven't heard. And I doubt, so you're going to take that long to determine your cost application. So we're going to have cost applications at completely different times. I wonder if is there no mechanism to ask PINs to actually have the same person, whether it's you or the cost team, dealing with, or in fact the cost. I just suppose the cost team could deal with the substantive aspect because it's going to be relevant to your decision. Is there no discretion for you to determine the whole thing?
Well, see, this is where it gets complicated. Let's just think about this. As far as the substantive, in relation to appeal A, my assumption is that you would be making a claim for costs in relation to all of the costs relating to appeal A.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you call it substantive, procedural, or whatever.
Yeah.
But that obviously would just relate to ground D.
Yeah.
You can still make an application for a substantive award in relation to appeal B,
yeah,
which I would deal with. And the only difference is that part of your claim would be that an inquiry was necessitated by appeal A.
Yeah, because we would have to put in that application that the inquiry, you know, the circumstances, regrettable as they are, you know, why no proofs were produced, why we came here in September when, really, is why the inquiry sat and, you know, when it didn't need to. That relates to both appeal A and appeal B. So we just put it in both applications, and
obviously the amount of cost has nothing to do with me.
No.
But the I mean, I know Mr. Hardy's got concerns about the way the application was made, but you're saying that you're seeking substantive award of costs in relation to
appeal. Well, appeal D and on a procedural basis,
but also on appeal B. Grounds and appeals getting mixed up here.
Yeah.
Appeal B. You're saying that the ground A case had no reasonable prospect of success.
Yeah, I mean, if I need to take instructions, but the answer may be that if they have to be dealt with by two different people, what may make sense is that we start again, do it all in paper, and send everybody all the information so everyone knows what everyone else is doing. But it just seems
right. You asked me whether there's any scope for
yeah.
I
mean, you know, you'd like to do another.
Yeah, the difficulty is that, like I said, I have to remind myself of this situation. And now I know there have been numerous occasions when inspectors had merrily dealt with cost applications for withdrawn appeals because they weren't aware that they weren't supposed to, you know.
Yeah.
The problem with that is, what standing does that decision actually have? But there is a middle ground, but it's a little bit complicated. The middle ground is that in relation to appeal A, I effectively do like a report to the Secretary of State with a recommendation on costs, and the Secretary of State, through the cost decision team, effectively formally makes the decision on it, having regard to my recommendation. It's just a bit fiddly because I did be making a decision on part of it and a recommendation on the other. But I'm just trying to think through what the practical consequences are of doing it either way.
I suppose the other way to do it is we simply start again. I think we'd have to start again, do it on paper, and then internally PINs just work out what they want to do with it.
Yeah, right. I'm not entirely in favour of that for the reasons I'll come on to in a moment, because I would still be, that the chances are the cost decision team would say to me, you deal with that part of it because you did the inquiry, as far as, you know, so they wouldn't want to be involved in that.
Okay.
Withdrawn appeals are relatively straightforward. The starting point is, you know, withdrawal of an appeal is one of those things that will, you can rebut this, but the starting point is that it may result, you know.
Would a solution be that they're asked to only deal with the actual late withdrawal of the appeal? So what we would argue essentially is that, well, the appeal should have been withdrawn earlier. And they'll say, no, there was a very good reason why we withdrew it at minutes 10. And then you and then you deal with everything else, including the failure to produce proofs and everything. Otherwise, we're not going to know who to put the application to.
But let me explain why I'm not, because this links into what was being said further about whether applications should be made and responded to in writing or not. I can tell. I mean, the planning practice guidance indicates that it's normal to hear applications at the inquiry itself. It does say that obviously the respondent should have an opportunity to respond if necessary in writing. And I said to you earlier, I'd make a decision about whether I thought it was necessary for you to have that time. The planning inspector's own practice is to deal with them at the hearing or inquiry, save in I think the expression it uses is very exceptional circumstances. Now, one of the reasons for that, and this is my take on it, because the guidance doesn't actually say so, but one of the reasons for that is when you're making applications for costs in relation to substantive matters, what you will often see in a written cost application is things which should have been said about the merits of the appeal as part of the appeal itself. And you have it gets really difficult because people use it as an opportunity to make arguments they should have made before that actually relate to the substance of the appeal. And that's one of the reasons for not doing it in that way.
So in that case, so what we could do is to deal with it, subject to my own friend's objection, to deal with it all orally tomorrow, and then you hive off the different bits to the relevant. So you deal with what you can deal with, and then you ask Pins.
Well, as I say, that's one middle ground idea.
But then Pins are going to be some cost team in 8 months' time when they get around to dealing with it, are going to have your notes from what was said, and that's going to be quite hard for them to deal with, isn't it? I mean, I'm sure your note's excellent, but it's
well, as I said, the way it would work is I would be making a decision on appeal B and a recommendation on appeal A at the same time.
Yeah.
Normally we don't issue. Normally we issue cost decisions at the same time as the appeal decision, so we don't want the appeal decision being delayed. Sorry, this is a little bit confused, but it's just once you start thinking through the implications, it's not as straightforward.
I think that's probably the simplest from our point. Well, I think from everyone's point of view. There is a little bit more work for. Unless I've been doing all the talking, I don't know if friends of you.
I'm listening with interest. I mean, I hesitate to raise procedural experiences again. It simply isn't my experience. I've gone back over the last 5 cost applications I've dealt with. They're obviously not made that often, but over the last 12 months, 5 cost applications, all have been dealt with in writing, and they've been dealt with a 7-day response period.
But sorry to interrupt, but has that been because there isn't necessarily time to deal with it at the inquiry?
No, it's been dealt with on a fairness and proportionality basis. But that's my experience. That's just my experience. I can't see why these matters can't be dealt with in. I can't see why these matters can't be dealt with in writing, so that both elements are put in writing. I'm given the opportunity to respond. You deal with your bit, and Pins deals with the other part.
Well, so I've given my view as to why I prefer them not to be just in writing. As I say, and point the other thing I'd say, I made a joke about boasting about my 20 years of experience as a planning inspector, but I also before that had experience as an advocate doing planning inquiries. So I've had to make and respond to planning cost applications on. I know this was in the old days, but planning cost applications on the hoof, as say, both making them and responding to them. So, you know, as so everybody's got different experience, and I suppose there are perhaps planning inspectors who deal with things on a different basis, but they're not necessarily doing it in the way that Pins is telling them they should deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the variations, all I can do is give you that's the benefit.
Yeah.
Right here, I can't see what personally I can't. It's a matter for you, and you clearly got quite strong views on precision. It's absolutely fine, but I can't see why this shouldn't be set out in writing properly with a full written response, and you just hive off the bits you need to. I can't see the prejudice myself.
Yeah, well, apart from the stages in the process, there's a written application. You get to respond. The council get the final word on it. And as I say, there's a danger that matters get raised in the representations on costs, which are
they just have to be ignored. I mean, they're not supposed to be there, and that would be inappropriate to do. So, I don't think that's a reason not to do it.
Anyway. Because a lot comes down to just what in addition, what you're going to say in addition to what you've already put in writing.
Yeah, which isn't very much because some additional costs about
Okay. All right. So we're at.
I mean, I don't be difficult, but just don't be surprised if I make an application tomorrow based on exception.
Well, I won't be surprised.
Exactly. So, I mean, it seems sensible just to deal with it all now, but I think that's where we'll be.
Well, as I said, the reason I'm not dealing with it now is because if Mr. Leafhead makes a couple of very brief comments in addition to what he's already put in writing, then I don't see why you should need a lot of time to actually respond to that. So particularly since as far as the withdrawal is concerned, you must have anticipated an application for costs. And unless Mr. Leafhead comes up with a ground for that application, which you couldn't have anticipated, then, you've already had time.
My concern, I mean, we've actually spent about 45 minutes talking about this. In terms of the time before, the cost application wasn't clear to me, and we've had some debate. All I want to understand is the final resting position of the council, and then and have a fair and proportionate way to respond. If that's going to be just a little bit extra, that's fine. But I don't know if you've read my response. It was a detailed look at the way that application is cast, and it seems on any basis that is going to be recast.
Well, so we'll see.
Yeah,
we'll see. Right. So we're on to that. And as far as the agenda is concerned, two things. For some reason, I put conditions at 7. I think that makes sense to deal with that right at the end. So I'll relegate that to the end of the discussion. And then there was also ground G, which isn't on the agenda. And I said at the outset to Mr. Leafhead that I'd give him an opportunity to comment on that aspect after opening submissions, and then I forgot to do that. So
other point, that is site visit. So I have spoken to, Mr. Telford spoke to the owner, and unfortunately he is away tomorrow. And apparently it's an appointment. Was it health appointment? It's an appointment that's been booked for 6 months anyway. Yes. Mr. Telford can't be there tomorrow because.
Well, what was?
We get there. No, we get there.
Sorry,
Mr. Telford can't be there tomorrow because his wife's got so I will go. However, the property is going to be open. I think Tyler Harris, who is the girl who lives, or the lady who lives in lived in the lodge, she will be able to open the gate. So all I was going to say was that we're not going to, and I think the garage building will be open as well. But we're not going to have Mr. Telford, and it's not going to be the landowner. It will just be me, which is slightly unusual for a site visit, but that will to facilitate tomorrow.
Okay, it's also unfortunate because that was the time I was expecting you to have an opportunity to finalise your closing, well, some of the time, you'd be able to finalise closing submissions, but.
So this has been in the diary for months, and there's been a constant feature of this. Helen's not here, his witnesses aren't here, things are pulled out, Mr. Telford's not here. It is extreme.
Health appointments are health appointments, and you've got my views on whether I think the council's behave reasonably. All I'm saying is that it will be me tomorrow. There won't be anybody else, the landowner, and it'll be me, but there will be access to the garage.
Does that cause you any problems, Mr. Lee?
As long as you can see what you need to see. I mean, as before, you know, my own friends got strong criticism of the council in this. The council is extremely sympathetic to Mr. Telford's wife. In fact, many of us would have had personal experience of that sort of issue. But the fact is, the inquiry was booked for 2 days. Mr. Telford knew that if he had a problem with the second day, he could have raised it weeks ago.
Not standing in the way of the site visit. I'm just telling you who's going to be there.
All right. Okay. Okay. Well, if you're happy with Mr. Hardy being there, it doesn't really matter. So, okay. Sorry, I almost got a preemptive strike.
Gave your view before you heard what I got to say.
Yes. Very bad trait for an inspector, that is. But there we go. Right. So that takes us to item 6 on the agenda. But we've talked about other considerations in terms of the fallback position. So the question for the appellants really is, are there any other considerations that you think I should be taking into account to weigh against the harm by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm that I find?
To say so, just as a catch-all thing, is just to draw your attention to the fact it is in the written proofs as well. We're picking up highlights here, so the council will rely on all of its written evidence as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if Mr. Hawley wants to highlight anything in addition. No. And just also, if you'll notice, well, some of these points are sort of buried in the ground C material. So the calculations of height, they're different paragraph numbers relevant to the garage, the new garage, and the unfinished building. They fall foul of different height areas. That's within, I think, the ground C section of Mr. Because that was the PD, because it was ground C was the PD point. So the various it will be necessary to look at those sections, and I can try and draw some of that out in the in the closing submissions overnight. The appeal's taken an unusual course.
Okay. So then if we go on to, I mean, I'm not putting words into your mouth when I say you obviously don't think the harm is clearly outweighed. You think it is. It's not really much more to say on that score, is there?
It's an unfinished building in the greenbelt in a particularly sensitive landscape location. So we've made it clear that the ground has no merit at all.
I think in summary, it's an inappropriate development which harms openness, spatial to a spatial and visual extent, and there's no very special circumstances.
So there's also a point about Mr. Telford referred to an appeal decision in his, I think he called it his witness statement. It's essentially his supplementary, or I think there already was a supplementary proof, but the latest one, the post-September proof. He didn't name the appeal decision. We did our best to find it. He's done his best to find it. Nobody can find the appeal decision to which he refers. There's a news story that refers to it. But we would say very little weight indeed can be given to an appeal decision that no one can find. Unless, of course, you pull the rabbit out the hat, sir. And,
Well, I'm not digging, I'm not digging around things.
I'll have a look.
with respect, it's a bit late to, if we've not had a chance to comment on a decision that's not before, so putting.
I can put some legal authorities in if I find it might be helpful. Obviously, if the inspector doesn't want to see it, that's fair enough.
Well, we would get
I would go and make the application. In relation to what the council has said, if I might respond, I think it exposes two mistakes. Firstly, this isn't just an unfinished building, and that's what my learned friend said. There is, of course, one finished building, that's the garage. You have to deal with both of these appeals separately. The garage, we say, merits consideration on its own. You may come to a view that that actually is more acceptable, causes less harm, and therefore the VSC case in relation to that is different. So
I seem to have been having a bad pen day.
a bad pen day. I've had one of those too. Two of mine have packed up today, so it's probably catching in the building. So there are two separate buildings. Clearly, it isn't just a case of an unfinished building. You've got one, and I think you may form a view that there are differences between the two, and that harm caused by the garage is rather lesser. And in relation to a ground A, you may say, well, actually, proportionality and so on means that the garage is cast in a better light than the other building. So that's the first point. The second, I think, is a common mistake that Mr. Hawley makes, which is that he was trying to, or referring to, there not being very special circumstances, as if that is the input. Very special circumstances, of course, are the output, and we know that from paragraph 148. That is the state of being, the state of circumstances which exist if the harm caused by definitional harm and any other harm is clearly outweighed. So we're not looking for a list of very special circumstances.
The thing is, I'm painfully aware of this because the one time one of my decisions has ever been, touch wood, stupid to say this, ever been quashed back in about 2008 was on this very point, but it was because my decision was made before the Court of Appeal decision in Wychavon came out. So up until that point, we all thought that the words very special circumstances, very special meant something. I still think the decision was wrong, because you don't need the words very special if all you say is the other circumstances clearly outweigh the harm. But I understand that is the point.
That's the analytical point. Exactly, that's the point. But what that does is then get back into, I don't want to labour, again, you've got strong views in relation to the analysis in paragraph 148. The equation only works or can work if you know how much harm there is. And the harm, it goes back to having the ball of harm to which you apply the substantial weight, and that's going to vary. And that will determine the consequence of that is that the wider benefits that are required to clearly outweigh may be lesser or greater.
Oh, yes.
Clearly, if you've got a smaller ball of harm to which you apply the constant of substantial weight, you might need fewer reasons.
There's no dispute about that. It's just that however small the ball of harm is, it will still carry substantial weight.
Absolutely.
That's the only point
Absolutely. Yeah, fine. Then we're absolutely in accord. And you may take the view, so just following on from that the garage actually causes a smaller ball, the ball of harm in relation to the garage is smaller than in relation to the other building.
I'm just slightly confused by that because in some respects, Mr. Telford was suggesting it might be the other way around because the garage wasn't as well related to the dwelling as
I'm just saying that
one or the other.
I'm saying one or the other. The point I'm making is that you can't lump them together. They both got their differences, and you have to form a view. That's the point I'm making.
Okay, thank you. So if we leapfrog 7 at the moment and go on to 8, Now, obviously, the enforcement notice itself says that its purpose is to remedy the breach of planning control. And just check that the parents agree that, having regards to the requirements of the notice. Thank you. That was a quick one. 9. So the allegation says the breach is the construction of the 2 buildings. So can I just ask the council, so why then is the removal of the hard standing necessary to remedy that specified breach?
Because the hard standing appears to be part and parcel of the building. It is included within the building operations themselves. Certainly the installation of any underground infrastructure to serve that building is part of the building. And within the steps of the notice, it's appropriate to require all those works to be reversed.
Any response to that?
So the notice refers to the building, and the hard standing is not part of the building at all. The hard standing, unless they're talking about the hard standing being the hard standing on which the building is erected, then the hard standing does not form part of the building. The notice refers to unauthorised buildings. If they'd wanted the hard standing, they would have, and they felt that hard standing required consent, then the notice should have been more specific and referred to all the issues that they want removed, not just the unauthorised building itself. So we would argue, in fact, that it's excessive. What that does, of course, is raise SOMAC travel. I'm sure you're aware. SOMAC travel against London Borough of Brent, 1987. And our view is that that doesn't fall foul of the principle about facilitation. It's a separate part.
Yeah, I mean, at SOMAC travel and Murphy, they're about changes of use and operational development, which facilitates that rather than operational development associated with other operational developments. I don't think it applies anyway.
I would agree, and there's more recent authority on that as well. The
just out of interest, what is that more recent authority?
I was just trying to think. It's well, I can remember it's that sex club in the countryside. Do you remember? You know the case, the really famous. I'll get.
Do you know what? That's Kestrel Hydro.
Kestrel Hydro.
That was my appeal.
Was it? Oh, that one. Well, it was apart from the terrible decision.
Not my appeal, but my case.
Was it? Yes, Kestrel Hydro deals wraps all those points together.
Yes.
So that's the authority.
So when you said more recent, I was thinking because that was quite a long time ago now. Something.
Yeah, it was, but it's more recent than so much travel.
Yes.
I
think I know Keith Lindblom said to one of his colleagues in Chambers that was a case which was interesting on its facts.
It's every time someone suggests me the planning law is a bit boring, but I'll
be dining out on that one.
I was actually going to say something important, but which I thought was important. But so you do of course have the power to vary the enforcement notice.
Yes,
unless there's prejudice to the other side, and so it's been abundantly clear what everyone's been talking about. So I can't see if you were to vary the notice to include the hard standing that there'd be any prejudice whatsoever to the appellant.
Well, I need to get your response to that, either Mr. Telford or Mr. Hardy, or sorry, Mr. Hardy.
Well, there would be prejudice, and the basis on which this the council is very keen to say it's been running a long time. Absolutely, that's the notice. That's what's been responded to. So if the council now wants to say actually it's not correctly formed and relying on your discretion to amend, we would oppose that.
But the fact is, Mr. Telford has responded to it in his evidence. He has considered the hard standing. So it's difficult to see.
Well, yes, to say that it's not part of the evidence is it's not part of the same not part of the same development, what you're now seeking to do, is change that, and we say that is prejudicial. So it's just a quick. This is Mr. It's the witness statement of Mr. Telford, and it's paragraph 4.29.
But 430, Roman 1, removal of hard standing as the it's considered unreasonable to require the removal of hard standing as the appellant will use the land as car parking or garden, and the removal of the hard standing and its retention will have no impact on the openness of the green belt. So it's just, it wasn't, I mean, I've raised this point, but it wasn't the case that's been put hasn't been put on the basis that that it was not part of the alleged breach.
Yeah.
So just on that basis, Mr. Hardy, if at the moment what the appellant is aware of is that there's a notice which, apart from requiring the demolition of the buildings, requires the removal of the hard standing.
Yeah.
And he's put the case on the basis that, well, actually, I can use it, you know, in relation to as car parking or garden, etc. If in addition it said that the notice should be corrected so the allegation specifically refers to that hard standing, in what way is he worse off, or in what way would that have changed the basis upon which the appeal was made?
No, can we just be clear?
Yes.
Which hard standing is actually being specified? Anything that forms part and parcel of the building. And the notice relates to building operations.
So if you look at figure 18 on paragraph 10.5 of Mr. Hawley's statement, sorry, or his witness statement. Mr. Hawley's statement, you're going to give us the reference? It's paragraph 10.5, or it's the photograph under paragraph 10.5.
Oh, sorry, I thought your microphone wasn't on, but it is 10.5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The photograph shows the motorhome for a start, but is that the hard standing that's being talked about? There's a difference. It's actually people talking about different hard standings. If that's the, is that your point, Mr. Telford? Yeah, it's not the hard standing on which the building is. It's the other hard standing on which vehicles are parked. I think that's what Mr. Hawley's just said. It's the hard standing is where the vehicles can park.
What is meant by the notice is anything that's included within the building. That forms
Within-
part and parcel of the building operation.
So not
When you say within the building, you mean like the footprint of the building?
The footprint of the building, yeah. The notice refers to the buildings.
Oh, all right.
It doesn't allege the construction of hard standing.
Okay, so all right.
Those
So
buildings.
in that case, I think it does need correcting, but in a way which actually assists.
absolutely. That's what.
In fact, I'm not sure whether it's necessary to. It's unusual to refer to hard standing under a building. I mean, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Maybe drafting error.
Yeah.
It may well have been better to have
I
had a
see.
slab or any.
Yeah.
It's a firm base, isn't it, on which a building is.
Okay. All right. Well, we were clearly at cross purposes, but let's just have a look at the notice B. isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be pretty well understood that, for example, if you have to remove the building, you've got to remove the foundations and so on, and remove all that arising from that demolition. So this is including any found range connections and operations. Is there an alternative wording that you would suggest?
Yeah, well, quite possibly. I'd be happy to have a look at it, but I just need to have a little bit of time to think about it.
Anyway, what's clear?
What's clear with the purposes of the notice is that they are there to target the buildings and anything that is integral to the construction of those buildings.
All right, I was
Some
just
of the-
assuming you were saying that all that hard standing that you can see in that photograph was part and parcel of the building, which was causing me a little bit.
I would probably have referred to that separately within the alleged breach.
And preferably
and
identified it on the
identified
plan, yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's not that hard standing as I've understood it.
You're not
That's why I
standing
was-
anything on it apart from the building, but
Yeah,
no. Okay,
Leave that to your discretions.
so if it said demolish the unauthorized buildings, including the slab, foundations, foul drainage connections, etc.
Place that's underneath it as well, but we don't really know what's. Yeah.
It's simply an underfloor heated.
No, it wasn't. I wasn't particularly there. It's just it was more that the wording captures everything under that building. We don't actually know what's there.
It doesn't need to be anything more than building.
It probably doesn't, but there's the reference to for buried tanks. Where are these buried tanks?
That is just based on an assumption of what may well be underneath that building. With the information that was available to us at that time, we made the requirements of the notice on that basis.
Heated. I think it's just part and parcel of the building.
So because a buried tank might, to me, have meant like a septic tank or something, you know, which wouldn't be under the building itself. Oh.
I understand that the toilet and shower is linked up to the existing, then it goes to the existing tank. There's no tanks underneath the building.
I've got a feeling this was mentioned on the 6th of September, but I've lost track of it. So the bottom line is, would the council have any problem with me simply saying, with me correcting the notice to simply refer to demolition of the building, to buildings? That's usually what notices do, and then you remove all the materials arising from that demolition. Don't normally detail everything that might be under the building itself. Like you say, it's part and parcel of the building anyway. Okay, I thought you were suggesting this wide, larger area of hard standing was part and parcel of the building, right? Okay. Okay.
Risk of labouring the point is, it says any hard standing foul drainage connections and or buried tanks. What you sometimes get with these things is people leave things under the ground in the hope that at some point they're going to get planning permission. And I think that eventuality needs to be captured.
Well, if they do get planning permission.
Yeah, that's fine, but
If they
otherwise,
don't.
I know, but you end up, I mean, this was in you know, the Sam Smith case, you get stuff underground and everyone says, well, it doesn't matter because it's in the green belt, you can't see it, but it does matter if you have a whole lot of underground stuff in the green belt. I think that's the point.
So I've never used, in 52 years in planning, I've never used the fact that there's a tank underground to justify planning consent for a building. I shall try that. So,
Well, it's more just leaving debris around the place, and that everybody's going to go everything needs to go too. I think that's the point. It's quite.
I think that, but that's, as I said, that's the usual.
Yeah.
If there's bits left there, then you would say, well, you've not properly demolished the building or removed materials arising from that.
Mr. Hawley could go out with his metal detector.
It's just I'm thinking, well, if I've not done this before in any other appeals, maybe me and all the other inspectors have been wrong, and other planning officers have been wrong by not referring to it. But I don't think I'm not aware of it ever having caused a problem.
So can I just mention on the photograph, while we've got the photograph in front, that the point I was making earlier about parking in that area, there's a gravel area there that we've now excluded from the terms of the notice, and you can see the size of that's the horse box that's there. The motorhome is slightly bigger. That's the area where vehicles that aren't used on a daily basis will be parked.
Now, the thing about this is that my question was on the assumption that you meant the notice to catch the hard standing. So on your understanding of things, it would have gone, but as I understand it, that's not what you intended anyway. So you approach this on the basis that the notice isn't requiring a removal of that. So unless other enforcement action can and is taken, that hard standing will remain. And so obviously that is a factor in terms of the fallback position, the likelihood of use for other things and so on, and the fact that there is an impact on openness in any event from the existence of the hard standing. I appreciate it's different from the building, but I appreciate there is an impact on openness
And the vehicles.
Yes, I mean.
At the point the notice was issued, there were a lot of this hard standing was covered in building materials, construction materials. Certainly wasn't being used before the garage went up for any parking.
And I haven't looked in detail at when it was there, so I'm not saying the council can't take action in relation to it. That's a matter for you to consider. But as far as this, well, I suppose I do need to know something about that in terms of how what account I take of the hard standing in terms of its impact on openness. If the council are going to take enforcement action to remove that separately, then that's something I suppose I need to be aware of.
Yeah, the council would need to consider that, and it's going to go to weight. Inevitably, it will impact on the openness. So the vehicles have been mentioned, but of course they're temporary in nature, and they're not and they're movable. They're not development as well. I've been on the other side and attempted to dissuade inspectors before about storage tanks being in their temporary nature and how they're definitely not impacting openness. The cars are going to have a very limited impact on openness.
It depends, doesn't it? I mean, for example, if you apply for planning permission for a car park for 2,000 cars, the chances are there's going to be a lot of cars on it a lot of the time, and therefore that is a factor in terms of the impact on openness. But certainly I accept that cars are not the same as buildings, and the degree of permanence is, well, if there's likely to be cars parked around a house. The number of cars, the nature of cars, the size of the vehicles and so on, and how long they're going to be there is going to vary, and it's going to be different from a large building. I appreciate that. But it's a factor, again, that I can take into account, that there's likely to be vehicles there. And if there's hard standing there, then perhaps it's more likely that there will be vehicles there. But as I said, I don't know whether the council will take action in relation to the hard standing, or whether there's any basis upon which that could be.
What you do have, of course, are the photographs. So the photographic record.
Yeah.
So going back in date, so you can see on the photographs, say 2016. Earlier than that, 2015 or 2016.
2016.
Is very clear. So we're 6 years on from that.
I think what is telling is the difference between 2020 and 2022. So that is figure paragraph 8.27 compared with 8.39. A significant change in the size.
Our standing is the same. We go back to the point.
Well, it isn't, not on the basis of those photographs, but
well,
the extent of it isn't the same.
There is well, I mean, it's a matter, obviously a matter for you. That looks like there's a nib off to the
in the 2022 photograph,
yes,
8.29, the hard standing appears to extend on the eastern end. It extends further to the south.
That's the bit I was going to say, the nib, isn't it? Just on that. They're obviously at different scales, or the different degrees degrees of magnification. The bit that the two cars are on the 2020, that's where the building is, and then it's that section immediately to the right of that, isn't it? There's a little bit of, there's an extension. That's what I was referring to as a nib. And it's a matter, obviously a matter.
Just on that matter of the hard standing, of course, if the council can't fit its discretion, but if it were to take enforcement action before your decision is released, that then would become a material consideration.
Well, say that it wouldn't necessarily be the end of the matter. There might be an appeal against it.
Yeah, of course. But you asked about intention,
and I'll pass it to somebody else. No, it'd probably get passed to me, but anyway. Right. I mean, on reflection, I should have thought a bit more about the fact that the extent of the hard standing wasn't identified on the plan in any event, on the notice plan in any event. But I was, as I say, labouring under a misapprehension anyway. Right. Okay. That was interesting. Debate was different to what I was expecting on the hard standing, but there we go. And we've really covered the removal of the foul drainage and berry tanks as well. There was no, well, the removal of materials following. So we're on 11 now. The removal of materials following demolition, but. Mr. Telford, I've obviously heard what's been said about the value of the materials and the intention of the appellant to do something else with them. But time would tell as far as that's concerned, but wouldn't it be fair to say that there'd be a lot of materials? Well, that's the question really. There'd be a lot of materials left after the demolition of these buildings.
There is a lot of material, that's why it's obviously got a value that it has. There's a question about store.
Well, that's the point. There's a lot of materials. There's also been an indication that, well, what would happen then is an application for a certificate of lawfulness, which could result in another appeal. It could be a long time before these materials are used in any or all of them are used in any alternative permitted development building. In the meantime, they're all on this site, and effectively that's a storage use, is it not? If there's a lot of, I mean, that I'm talking very basic terms there, but it's a question of whether there's a material change of use. But
the answer is no, I don't think there is. And it's storage of wood. And that's the bit that's the expensive part of this. It's timbers. And you know, that obviously needs to be kept, it's difficult to move, it needs to be kept in dry and so on, but it's got no.
Why do you say it's difficult to move?
Heavy. I don't know, it's a specialist job to take this down. When you see it, the size of the
but it's going to be taken down if I uphold the notice.
Yes, so it needs to be done by that. That's why it needs to be done by a specialist firm. It's not something, you know,
that's a different issue. That's moving on to ground G route, surely, isn't it?
Yes. No. It's in terms of storage. It's about, you know, that this can't be the reason for saying in terms of heaviness. If the suggestion was going to be this was easy to move off site, that's the point.
Right.
So storage wise, I don't think it is a material change of use, and it is, you know, there are building materials which are related to the residential property, and therefore I don't think you run into a difficulty.
Well, as I said, if for example you'd got planning permission for the construction of these other buildings and there were buildings on site, then I don't suppose the local planning authority would be taking enforcement action against storage use. They might come a point where they did, but with a couple, at least one stage removed from that, in that you're saying you'd apply for the advice to the appellant would be to apply for a certificate of lawfulness. I don't know whether that would get refused or not, because it depends on where you're proposing to do these things and this whole argument about curtilage and all the rest of it. If it is refused, there could be an appeal. So as I said, the materials could be there for a long time, and you couldn't say at that point, until those proceedings were resolved, that they were there in order to construct a building for which you'd got permission or which was going to be lawful.
Yes, but I mean, the council, if it was going to enforce, and I don't know if that's where this is going, I mean, they've got the devil's own job showing that's expedient to enforce in those circumstances.
Well, you know, I can't preempt that.
Well, that would be may well form the subject of other satellite proceedings. I mean, if there is a clopper which is going to be determined and there's an appeal, and the council thought that it was right to take enforcement action against storage of those building materials, I'd say best of luck to them.
Back on storing stuff in the greenbelt for extended periods of time in a sensitive valley landscape is not usual.
So would it constitute development, storing domestic timber on a site? There's no change of use of the land. It's not commercial.
Well, it doesn't have to be commercial.
There might be a section 215 notice or some.
Well, that's but it doesn't, to be storage, it doesn't have to be commercial. You don't.
No, I wasn't making that point. I was making, but it is completely commensurate with the size of the residential unit having building materials on site, which for the intention of putting up domestic related buildings. It's not a change of use, in my view.
Anyway, it's a question which I cannot determine in the course of this appeal, but it's just part of that issue of whether it's necessary whether the requirements exceed what is necessary to remedy the breach and restore the land to its condition prior to the breach. That's the purpose. We will just talk about remedying the breach, but the breach, the provision in the Act talks about remedying the breach and restoring the land to its condition prior to the breach.
Yes, but this, I mean, unless the storage might be on the land next door, so that wouldn't stop the land from being restored.
The land next door.
Well, as in restoration of the site, you take away the building. That's that's fine. That happens. So I think what you're talking about is storage of the building materials. That doesn't. There's no conflict there. I don't think that's a question which goes to restoration of the land, having storage of the building material.
Then why is it normal practice to require all the materials to be removed?
It depends. It depends. It's all fact specific. Here, the evidence is you've got there's all sorts of sustainability. You've got expensive wood, which you are proposing to use. And
I know, but sorry, but that's a different point. If you're saying that it's not necessary to remove the materials to restore the land to its condition prior to the breach, then that requirement is always inappropriate. But it's always in there.
Well, you've got buildings which you break down where you don't reuse the materials. Because here,
I know, but that's a different. You're saying that's a reason why they should stay. My question is about what is necessary to remedy the breach, and you were suggesting that if the building was taken down and the materials are put next door on a different piece of land to where the building was, then that doesn't prevent the land being restored to its condition prior to the breach. But as I say, that suggests that requirement is always inappropriate in notices. It's always there.
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that in this case with these materials.
There's plainly nothing exceptional about this case. If a notice might be to remove a house and you might store the bricks, they're building materials, you'd never have that on. That would never be allowed in any enforcement appeal. It's entirely reasonable to require the land to be restored to its previous condition, and that's in the Act, and that's in every enforcement appeal that anyone's ever seen. There's nothing exceptional about this case to take it outside of that.
Okay, thank you. I think we've touched on this, but the appellant also says that it's the area was not grass before. So is that's again, maybe look at the photographic evidence. I think you've already referred to it, but it depends on how far back you go, doesn't it? And again, bearing in mind that presumably you're just talking about the area where the buildings are.
Correct.
So should that, just to avoid any confusion, should that say reseed the ground within the footprint of the buildings?
Restoring the land back to its former condition, then yes, I think that's probably more appropriate.
Any views on that from the appellants?
Is that immediately before the building and the works were commenced to construct the building? So it's immediately before.
I'd like to hear what you're going to say next.
I'm just looking at the photographs. You look at 2020, where the building is, and if you look at ground photographs, it was a partly hardcore, partly lumpy, but there was a lot of material in that corner. And if you look at the March 2022 photograph, the wiggly bit of material south of the building is spoil that was taken out from where the building is.
I don't think they're asking you to put that back.
Sorry?
I don't think they're asking you to put the spoil back where it was.
Well, I'm just wondering, but it was because they're asking for it to be grassed and seeded as well. I don't think that area, if I remember rightly, was grassed and seeded before the building was put up. It's a case really. What condition was it before the building was put up? There's nothing specifying that.
So I think we're looking forward to seeing your reference to the wiggly bit in your decision.
It's for the appellant to understand how best to restore the land.
In that
carry
case,
out the work.
you see, again, that's another, although it always feels a bit unsatisfactory, it's common and it's been held to be adequate for a notice to say restore the land to its condition prior to the breach without actually specifying what that condition actually is. You've just said it's for the appellant to know effectively what the condition was. So in that case, should the notice refer to reseeding with grass, or should it simply say restore the land to its condition prior to the breach? And then the local authority would be faced with taking a view on whether they've actually done that or not. But that's what notice is. I mean, I'm not saying they never say reseed with grass, but what I'm saying is it's been held to be sufficient to say that restore the land to its condition prior to the breach.
Yeah, I think we'd prefer to stick with what we've suggested. It just seems cleaner and much easier, much more straightforward.
It does seem straightforward, but in answer to what Mr. Telford said, are you able to say what the condition was prior to the breach? If you can't say that it was seeded, that it was covered with grass, then maybe it's not appropriate to require that.
Well, yeah, I mean, looking at the aerial photos, it would at least indicate that part of that field is grass.
Yeah, quite difficult to specify.
Yeah, it is.
And obviously with depending on the nature of the hard standing, often there is hard standing with grass going through it. In an aerial photograph, it's very hard to tell.
So can I take exception once again, as I've done all the way through this, the statement of common ground, this is not a field. Mr. Hawley keeps referring to it as a field. It's part of.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to get.
Well, the requirements for notice have got to be clear and precise, and this is part of it.
Save that they can say restore the land to its condition prior to the breach, and that's sufficiently clear and precise according to the courts. But as I said, the key question is: can you say that its condition prior to the breach was grass? If you can't, then the notice shouldn't really say that.
So it can be on the balance of probabilities. It doesn't have to be certain.
Oh no, I realise that.
And looking at the aerial photographs, it looks like grass. I think it's Mr. Hawley's point.
Okay. I mean, as far as yeah, I mean, where the building itself is, even when you compare it with the image at figure 16, it appears to be predominantly grass under the footprint of that building. Is that fair? And that very far northeastern corner,
Yeah, it
where the
wasn't-
building is.
It wasn't flat. It was lumps and bumps of all kinds of soil and material and goodness knows what else. And I think there's a photograph in there, I can't quite find it at the moment. It shows it was where material had been partly tipped over a number of years, partly where building material had been moved. I think I remember when there was a ramp at one time going past the garage up onto the elevated parking area, and then you went down the other side. That lump was taken out and a lot of that material was pushed to the far end. So it might have been grasped from an aerial photograph, which obviously two-dimensionally everything looks flat. But in reality, I'm sure if I recall rightly, it wasn't like that at all.
Okay, well, we've had wiggly bits, but the notice could require us to, reseed and reinstall lumps and bumps.
Very technical here.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Now, as I said, Mr. Leatham, I forgot to give you the opportunity to comment on the introduction of ground G. Was there anything you wanted to say about that? Mm. Mm.
3 months seems reasonable. 6.
Okay, I don't think you told me what did you say? Did you say?
I didn't know. So talking to the owner yesterday, it's a specialist job. It's a specialist outfit. You've also got obviously winter conditions. So I'm not trying it on, but I think the suggestion was sort of 6 months, and it might be 6 months plus 3 to actually do the work. I don't think there's a problem with the actual. He hasn't got a contract in place to remove it, but it's a specialist job. Given winter, instructions were that you were looking at 6 to 9. So that would take us through to where we're now, December, January.
That's perhaps an appropriate point for me. We're not really supposed to say when our decisions will be issued. Obviously, the time doesn't start to run until I issue my decision, and that's assuming you don't win. But I shouldn't say assuming you don't win. If you don't win, I always used to be able to say my decisions. I write my decisions quickly, etc. And I can't promise anything, but it's not likely to be very long. My situation has changed a bit in terms of the nature of my job, in that I'm sort of 50% doing my own inquiries and so on, and 50% sort of line managing people. So it's taking me longer to write decisions because I've got many more things to juggle. So all I can say is I will write it as quickly as possible. But if I get to this point of considering how long it's going to take, I'll be bearing in mind what point we're at as far as the date of issue of the decision is concerned and the impact of winter and all the rest of it. May. Yeah. I'm going to stay impassive.
We're going to be into well into spring.
The other problem I have is that when things like this happen, this case was adjourned, it just gets slotted in to a point in my program where I haven't been allocated time for actually writing the decision. So I have that juggling exercise, and of course there's Christmas as well. So I'm not expecting you to start being terribly sympathetic towards me, but I'm just saying I'm not as quick as I used to be for these various reasons. I like to get decisions off my desk as quickly as possible, but things are stacking up against me a little bit. Right, so that takes us rather to the consideration of conditions, but if you don't mind, I'd like a brief break before we discuss that. So I'll adjourn until just 10 to 4, if that's okay. set out, the suggested conditions are set out at 8.2 to 4 of Mr. Fawley's rebuttal proof. The first two relate to landscaping. I have something to say about it, but was there anything that you wanted to say? I'm not sure your microphone's on, actually.
Yeah, the two conditions that we touched on earlier and indicated that they will be acceptable if the decision was favourable. The landscaping condition certainly is something that we would welcome, and the client was already, or the appellant was already going to do that anyway.
Right. What I wanted to say about it was that it's the usual problem we have with retrospective cases, in that you have to ensure the condition has teeth, because the question arises, well, what, not so much what happens if a scheme isn't submitted, because you could issue a breach condition notice, but if a scheme is submitted and not approved, nothing else happens. So we end up with this somewhat convoluted standard form of condition which the planning inspector opposes, which says on the failure to achieve any of the following things, the development will be removed. So it looks it looks very harsh, but it's the only way of, or you could say, yeah, I think that's the only thing you can say. Sometimes you can link it to use, but so you have this stage where you've got to submit a scheme. If the scheme is approved, you've got to implement it, and the scheme should include a timetable for implementation as well, really. And if it's not approved, then you appeal within a certain period of time. And if the appeal fails, then you have to remove the development zone. So it's very cumbersome, and I thought we've looked at ways of trying to make it look more appealing than it does, but that's the only way we can really ensure that the condition has any kind of teeth.
Yes, absolutely.
I think the 3 months for submitting a scheme is very generous when it's the same time as it is to take the building down. So if they wanted it any quicker,
Don't look at your phone.
But it does have it has a knock-on effect on all the other timescales. If you've got a long timescale for that, then everything else gets put back. So what you're saying is you wouldn't object if it was, say, 2 months. I know that Mr. Hardy's looking very uncomfortable about that. But
I mean, look, let's be set. Yeah.
I'm bowing now.
No. Look, that's not the most important point. If you want to make it a couple of months, that's fine.
Yeah.
It is absolutely in a different category to taking down this building. So, yeah.
I think it's largely irrelevant whether it's 2 or 3 months, because the trigger is carry it out in the first available planting season. I mean, that may well be some time after it's approved. Unless the inspectorate's condition is more appropriate, in which case we'd welcome the scheme sooner.
I think, as I say, I think the normal way of dealing with this is to say that the scheme shall include a timetable for implementation. That's likely to be the first available planting season. Now, you've said, Mr. Hawley, that for the reasons set out in section 13.2, permission can't be granted for the unfinished building. Council cannot therefore suggest a condition requiring the building to be retained or completed in accordance with the submitted plan. So that's fair enough. We've had the debate about all that. Okay. Right, and removal of permitted development rights, again, you'll have, obviously it's something that we should only do in, it's not the normal thing to do, but there are reasons for it in this particular case in regard to the location.
Yeah, can I suggest that the word or the words any dwelling house be changed, because that covers, I think what that covers, I think it doesn't say what any dwelling house is. It could cover everything. I'm just wondering why it's worded as any dwelling house.
It was loosely worded because we were still dealing with the ground case and the possibility that there were two lawful dwelling houses there. I wonder if I might suggest that there is also a condition limiting the use of the unfinished building to incidental purposes only.
Well,
ancillary.
I mean, I could hear some of what you're whispering, and obviously, if it was no longer, if there was a material change of use, then planning permission is required. So you don't need a condition effectively saying you can't do something for which you haven't got planning permission. So I avoid conditions like that unnecessarily. I mean, often it's quite difficult with planning annexes and things. It's quite standard to say it should be ancillary, and you think, well, is it really necessary to say that? It's become standard practice to do so. But I don't think in this circumstance, when you've got buildings which are expressed to be for incidental purposes, and if they were no longer for incidental purposes, the chances are they would need planning permission anyway. So
I'm just thinking aloud, take us back to this curtilage point. What happens if they're outside the curtilage?
well, I think if planning permission is granted for them as incidental, the thing is, the curtilage is a movable feast, isn't it? The curtilage can change.
Yes,
So-
indeed it can, but so I think it would need to be clear that we're not going to end up with a nice new house and a nice new garage.
You'd still need planning permission, even if it was a different, even if it wasn't in the curtilage, it'd still be a change of use. If it became a dwelling.
Yeah,
If it was ancillary though and still within the planning unit, then it wouldn't need planning permission as a change of use. You can convert a incidental outbuilding to an ancillary outbuilding by putting, day-to-day living accommodation in it as an extension of the house. So is what I'm just speaking about, is there merit in a condition which prevents that from happening? Imagine if you've got an ancillary outbuilding of that size with all the day-to-day, living equipment that the house has. Is it then more straightforward to apply for permission to convert that?
see this owner's quite happy with his golf, it sounds, and his indoor clay pigeon shooting. But somebody else may think, well, there's a nice garage there and a nice something that looks a bit like a house.
And
That could pose a problem. Well,
if it's used as a separate dwelling, it would need planning permission. If it's used as
ancillary, yeah.
if it's I mean, there's a whole debate about what, because these words ancillary, incidental get used all the time without, often without people really knowing exactly what they
Well, I
mean
have
by
to
that.
say, we've all, we mustn't mention the training manual, but the inspectorate distinguished between the meaning of the words, which the courts don't really.
No,
And
no.
actually, the pins, I think it's helpful.
Good, because
Um,
I'm mainly responsible for that.
Really?
And not all inspectors think it's helpful.
But so I think that is anyway. That was just something which occurred. If there are any further conditions, which I mean,
I think the difficulty with ancillary is that often what people are talking about is something which is simply part of the primary use of the land. So, for example, if you've got an outbuilding and you put a bed in it and so on, and it's used as additional sleeping accommodation, then it's just all part of the overall use of the planning unit as a dwelling house and residential purposes. So there's no change of use, and you might call that ancillary accommodation. It doesn't really matter what you call it. There's no change of use. Incidental is different, because if it's primary living accommodation, it's not incidental. And obviously that's relevant in terms of section 55(2) in terms of permitted development rights. But to say that it should only be used, because you couldn't say that it should only be used for ancillary purposes, because it's not used as planned. It's used for incidental purposes, not ancillary. But so what you really mean is it shouldn't be used. I mean, if you're trying to say it shouldn't be used as additional sleeping accommodation, again, is that reasonable to do that? What the impacts, the main impacts would come if it became a separate dwelling, and you would need planning permission for that. If you used it for guests to stay in, is that necessarily any worse than the use that it's designed for anyway? It doesn't really make that much difference. So I think, and I'd need to be persuaded that there was a real need for such a condition. I shouldn't have told you about my involvement in all the bits in it that you like, I've written. They do, but as I say, there are debates certainly within the planning inspectorate. Only last week the debate resurfaced again, but the sort of topic here, but the conclusion I've come to really is that anyway, we as inspectors, we should use where the word is used in the legislation or in the regulations, stick with that word. So if it says incidental, don't start talking about ancillary. And beyond that, just be careful about whether it's what we're simply talking about is something which is part and parcel of the permitted, the lawful use or not. But like as I said, the standard granny annex condition uses the word ancillary. The GPDO uses the word ancillary when you're talking about putting extra stories on top of a dwelling. It talks about it should only be used as ancillary purposes, but it's not defined. This is the problem. The words aren't defined anywhere really. Well, thank you, but I don't always feel clear. You may change your mind when you see my Zoom. Right. Sorry, but rambling on there. But is there anything else we need to cover before arranging the site visit? No. Okay. So what I was thinking is maybe site visit around 9:30. Oh, well, yeah, that doesn't sound like a favourable response.
No, I'm traveling from Leeds.
Okay.
So if it was 10 o'clock, it would help me.
That's fine with me. Okay.
Meet at the site, is that the
Yes.
seems sensible to do that? There is, I'm told, the gate will be open. There is no, I don't think there is a.
I'm not sure, but it's always open.
It's all right. It's open to drive in. There's parking in front of the house. There's pavies down. There's plenty of space for three.
Because there isn't really anywhere else to conveniently park other than on the site.
So is it one, be three cars, and it one from the council? My car, your car, one from the council.
You don't have to, if you're happy for the other side to be represented by council, that's fine, you know, there's no skin off my nose, as long as
I'm
you're.
not going to make any submissions. All I'm going to do is just because nobody else is.
Yeah.
Quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, unless you want to walk down. to
That's
it.
savage Rottweiler.
Yeah, and I'm not being asked to go up the footpath and sign because it's agreed that I can't really see anything from there anyway, so.
Yeah,
Johnny Gate Lane is surface.
Oh, right,
yeah.
okay, yes, well, thanks for reminding me about that.
Yeah, I'll talk to my, I mean, one thing I have done is an inquiry before is to do closing submissions from a site around the table, but the client's not there, is it? So we're not, that's not going to be terribly. Yeah, and then back here.
Well, and the other
Yeah.
thing is we've been,
Of course, we've got this, yeah.
okay, so site visit at 10 o'clock. Now, I think I will probably have, having seen everything around the area, but we've got to go to Johnny Gate Lane. I forgot about that. So if we allow,
You could do,
I could do that.
just a suggestion, if you do that on an unaccompanied basis
Good night, yes. I'll do that.
beforehand, and then it's just the bit in the property,
That
that's
means-
the accompanied basis.
I have to get up earlier than everybody.
I'm not, it does, but. Well, it's only, I mean, it's
I'll
15 minutes. Is
Forego my second glass of claret at breakfast and get there beforehand and go and have a look at Johnny Gate Lane. Okay, yeah, so I mean, probably half an hour might be enough on the site, but and then call it another half an hour to get back. If I say that we resume here not before 11 o'clock, if we're a bit late, then don't start without us, Mr. Leader. But gives us a bit of time. All right. Yeah. I know. I still haven't got out of the habit of turning up to site visits on rural sites and industrial sites in a suit. So people looking at me thinking, see. Anyway, so as I say, start site visit 10 o'clock and resume here not before 11 o'clock, and I'll look at Johnny Gate Lane unaccompanied.
It depends on the weather, but if it's, I haven't seen the forecast, but if it's inclement, then I might be not wearing a suit for the bit that's here. Is that acceptable?
Disgraceful.
Is that acceptable to you?
Validated proceedings.
Yeah.
Pins no longer has a dress code actually, but we're not really sure what that means for us in practice. You know, I haven't seen people pushing the limit, but
Things have changed, haven't they? I remember the day, you know, people used to turn up on site visits in short striped suits and all the rest of it, and now it is just jeans and.
wasn't that long ago that inspectors generally wore bowler hats.
Yeah, exactly.
You're quite happy with that, to be honest. Well, it's in the 80s. It was only in the 80s that stopped. But, yeah. Oh, yeah. I know. Well, a friend of mine, a colleague who retired recently, his father was a planning inspector, and it was normal for the council to send the mayoral Rolls Royce to pick you up from the station. You know, yeah. I mean, you know, I think it's something that should be reinstated. Yeah. Right. Okay. I'll adjourn until tomorrow. Thank you very much.